In the early hours of 17 September 2014, police entered Jadavpur University's campus in Kolkata. A relatively minor issue that ought to have been dealt with by the university's internal administration now spilled out into the street, becoming a national cause célèbre. It also became the first example of a new era of protest, or what we shall call, after the Argentinian protests of 2001, as horizontalism. I am Ashish Rajadhyaksha. Over this episode, I will also be Justice Mukul Mudgal and a publicity spokesperson for the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, while Ishan Gupta will be channeling Kamal Swaroop. Our voices have been cloned using AI tools in direct reference to a Supreme Court judgment that expresses a fear that the morphing of images,
change of voices, and many other technologically advanced methods
could create serious potential social disorder, and that we've all now turned into publishers, printers, producers, directors, and broadcasters.
Chapter 1: Horizontalism.
Jadavpur University had seen several days of protests long before that September. Inaction by authorities on an allegation of sexual harassment had already seen a gherao of the Vice-Chancellor. Abhijit Gupta, professor at the Department of English, recalls those days. It was a long history that culminated in that fateful night.
Of course, this was culmination, you might say, of several months of protest, not just several days. It was a very, at the beginning, it was a slow-burning protest. You see, the sexual harassment complaint that sort of acted as a catalyst and, in fact, brought the students into the fold of the movement was just one in a series of missteps.
That night, as police entered at the invitation of the Vice-Chancellor, a small and localized protest took on a national prominence. It was named Hok Kolorob, Let There Be Noise, in reference to a Bangladeshi song. This was perhaps the first major instance when the hashtag and the Twitter handle became key instruments of political action on the university campus. Hashtags had by then become clearing houses for aggregating and disseminating data. Themselves without content, they approximated to their true content only when they got translated into analog significance. This happened when the Hok Kolorob hashtag resulted in 100,000 people taking to the streets of Kolkata, calling for Jadavpur University's Vice-Chancellor to resign. The protest escalated across the city, ending only after a 150-hour-long hunger strike, leading to the Vice-Chancellor's eventual resignation on 12th of January 2015.
So by the time in the summer of 2014, while this movement was sort of coalescing, there were more, I wouldn't say clashes, but students began to protest, they began to sing, they began to, and music was a very important part of this whole movement. It was something which was quite new, even within Bengal's culture of political protests. The very, very innovative use of graffiti, music, doggerel, slogans were something new. I mean, we had become jaded with the kind of blunted instruments of left protests, buns and gheraos and so on. And so much of it was hashtag driven, memes, poems, and we were all making memes and all writing, quoting poems, and there were people writing in from all parts of the world. And this was after the march, the huge march which took place after that Lathi charge. There were many people, and many people joined that march who were really, not only were they not part of the Jadavpur University, they were not part of any academic institute. They were auto drivers, they were tailors, who I think, and it is interesting to revisit that moment because, what did that march signify? I mean, was it a larger frustration at, lack of governance? But of course, Trinamool had just come into power, so it couldn't have been that kind of a show of protest. Or was it? I mean, one has to go back. But it really was extraordinary, that march. I mean, between 50 to 100,000 people. I mean, no one really knows for sure. Drenched in rain, but almost everyone seems to have walked in it and brought central Calcutta to a standstill.
Chapter 2: The Protest and the Network.
The following year, as agitations took to the streets in processions and Occupy movements, they also brought into India what has come to be known worldwide as the networked protest, and by a term originally coined in Argentina in December 2001 as horizontalidad or horizontalism. That month, Argentina, facing a severe economic crisis, saw people take to the streets by the hundreds of thousands. Banging pots and pans and serenading officials, protesters forced out 5 consecutive governments, formed the first neighborhood committees grounded in horizontalidad, rejected representative democracy and the empowerment of leaders that such delegation of authority entailed, for this kind of politics was thought to have caused the crisis in the first place. Horizontalism was as much an aesthetic practice of music, theatre and filmmaking as it was a form of political mobilization. Seeking to overcome the traditional hierarchies of organized, leader-driven political action, the effort to create new democratic social spaces was enabled by new technologies permitting horizontal peer-to-peer circulation, authorless memes, and the rapid movement of what the 2019 Hong Kong protesters described as being water of data, ideas, and human action. Like the political authority they challenged, the protests in India that started after 2014 were both new and not new. They carried the memories of India's traditions of student actions that went back to 1969-71, the emergency, the 1980s anti-fee rise agitations, and the 1990s battles over reservations. Equally clearly, Hogg Kolarov brought into India in 2014 a mode that British Labour historian Paul Mason, speaking of movements that have engulfed much of the second decade of the 21st century, from Tahrir Square to Spain's Indignados and from Greece to Hong Kong, names the networked protest.
But you see this coming together of networks of educated people, I call them the graduates with no future, with the urban poor, with sometimes coming late to the party, organised labour. But this mixture is there everywhere the protests have been.
Such protests departed radically from classical modes, using methods that, according to Mason, did not seem archaic or at odds with the modern contemporary world, but were more in tune with modernity than the methods of their rulers. These were movements without a name, better seen as a trend, a direction, an idea virus, a meme, a source of energy that can be traced through a large number of spaces and projects, a way of thinking and acting, and agility and adaptability, a refusal to accept the world as is, to get stuck into fixed patterns of thought. A central departure of the network protest has been its abandonment of leadership and representation-driven action, and its replacement of the full-time political activist with amorphous and multiple identities and a pick-and-mix attitude to commitment, a kind of learned mercuriality. A second departure is in its ability to fuse different kinds of informational flows to enable sudden action. The networked public space combines the internet, the mobile phone, pre-existing social networks, street demonstrations, occupations of public squares, and Friday gatherings around the mosques, says Manuel Castell, speaking about Tahrir Square. Its primary purpose now becomes to create community to overcome fear.
What we are witnessing is the appearance of a new sort of social movement, which still are embryonic, and therefore they have not been able to alter fundamentally the policies that are being conducted. But this is just, as in many moments in history, this could be the beginning of a mobilization process.
Jai Bhim to all. Jai Bhim to all. My name is Rohit Vemula. I came from Guntur. My social background, I'm a Dalit coming from Guntur district, and I have been a student of University of Hyderabad from 2010, and now I'm doing PhD in social service department.
The story of Rohit Vemula is by now a national cause célèbre. He was a PhD student at the University of Hyderabad and a member of the Ambedkar Students Association. In July 2015, Vemula found his student stipend withdrawn after he was accused of raising political issues. That September, Vemula and 5 other students were formally suspended, and in January, after they were evicted from their hostels, they began a relay hunger strike that, it is well known, culminated in Vemula's suicide. By this time, the cinema had become a central presence on the campus. On August 3rd, Vemula organized his first major protest for the Ambedkar Students Association. The protest discussed several major issues they saw as having a national bearing. Amongst these, the death penalty given to one of the accused of the Bombay bombings of 1993. They were also protesting the attack that had taken place on Nakul Singh Sawhney's documentary film Muzaffarnagar Baki Hai, and they wanted to support the protest action going on at the time at the Film and Television Institute of India.
This is a very overwhelming moment for me. I was told that the screening of Muzaffarnagar Baki Hai on the 4th of August happened right here. When on the 1st of August in 2014, when ABVP goons, and I'm surprised that they have the audacity to call someone else a goon, but when these people barged into the Delhi University, the screening at Delhi University, heckled teachers, threatened students and said, "Stop this screening," even though they hadn't watched the film. Soon after that screening, students from the Ambedkar Students Association in Hyderabad, Central University, they got in touch with me and they said that they wanted to screen the film as a mark of protest and against this very undemocratic act by the ABVP.
Chapter 3, Cameras on the Campus.
G. Arunima was at the Center for Women's Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University in February 2016. She writes in a remarkable essay about the hyper-mediatized moment on the campus that JNU was placed under the scanner, transforming it from yet another university campus in India to something resembling a crime scene.
And I think that's what the proliferation of cameras, the use of cameras, and that's what made me think about many of the kinds of issues that are live in this essay, which is, we are surrounded by cameras. We are speaking on camera right now, for instance. So there is a way in which the camera has become a part of our lived reality. So 2016 was a very sort of strange time. It's also very interesting to reflect back on that now, because it's some years, and those have been long years in many ways. Much has happened in this period. The ground has been shifting continuously. We were in JNU, for instance, from 2015, well, certainly from 2014 onwards, but far more in 2015, there was this build-up to the fact that the Vice-Chancellor was about to change and things were going to change on campus. This is something that we knew. But we didn't realize, and we didn't think, and perhaps even he didn't think, that things would change so fast.
Within 24 hours of a cultural program meant to protest capital punishment and the ongoing political crises in Kashmir, mainstream Indian television channels like Zee News were airing clips that were supposedly secretly videographed at the program, claiming that this was part of JNU's anti-national activities. Arunima writes, "In the weeks and months that followed, JNU was put on a hyper-visible media trial."
But those friends who were still watching TV and mainstream channels at that time were aghast by the fact that ZTV and so on were carrying news about JNU and saying all kinds of things. And it is actually worth thinking about. I've thought about this quite a lot, and at some point when I have the time and space, I will write about the fact of so much of the kind of vocabulary that has become very commonsensical, the new normal in today's India, really comes from that time. Tukde gyan, anti-national, all of these kinds of things that are completely, we expect these to be spouted every other minute, literally, in every speech that is being made now. These kinds of phrases are being used, and a lot of that coinage was taking place, and that was the kind of grounds on which this was happening.
Currently, according to Arunima, there are at least 3 kinds of camera forms that proliferate in universities, with the 4th being proposed as a possible entrance into this space. There are CCTVs, photos, and videos taken by security personnel or the administration, those taken by students, and finally a proposal that classrooms could have cameras to facilitate massive open online courses. Given the kind of demands made of university administrations, the CCTV system becomes a part of the policy of visual surveillance.
So I think it was a very quick awakening about what could happen. Right? Now the interesting thing when I look back is that despite the fact that in the 2 or 3 months, because there was a time when some students went underground, they couldn't be found. There was all of that was happening. So initially, the then Students' Union President Kanhaiya was picked up, but the other students who were subsequently arrested as well, Umar Khalid and Anirban Bhattacharya, they were underground at that time. They couldn't be found. And there was a lot of panic, and people didn't know. Most of us had no idea where they had gone, and there was enormous amount of anxiety about what could happen. So there was huge amount of concern about students and how to keep a certain kind of politically sensitive awareness alive on campus, even as classes could take place. So we were teaching and this was happening, and I remember also, there's so much fatigue around so many issues now, but that's a time when WhatsApp groups were being made for the first time. You see, that's another sort of technological moment which really one needs to think about. Most of us are trying to exit from these kinds of things now.
She writes that there is a near complete absence of discussion on the status, legal or aesthetic, of the huge bodies of photographic materials that are now being produced on campuses. This at a time when all those producing such images consider their photographic production an integral part of an ongoing campus-based political activism. There is at one level something of an archive of resistance here, but there is also a return of the historic concern about photography and its truth claims, alongside new engagements with the idea of the political, particularly in relation to the visual.
Chapter 4: The Cinema and the Hacker.
The Information Technology Act of 2000 does not use the specific term hacker. But the Act clearly has such an entity in mind when it defines what is now a brand new category of criminal, a particular sort of disruptor, a combination of thief, impersonator, and squatter. Such disruption was the very opposite of another kind of disruption, one to which several authorities turned an increasingly blind eye. These were acts of direct vandalism that India saw across the early 2000s in the cinema, in art spaces, and in public events. In 2007 and 2008, vandals attacked and damaged paintings by M.F. Hussain in Delhi. In 2013, students of the FTII were attacked, and in 2015, a screening at the Kirodimal College of Nakul Singh Sawhney's Muzaffarnagar Baki Hai was disrupted. Such a form of what has come to be known as a heckler's veto would have multiple consequences, organizational as much as formal. Here is media theorist Ravi Sundaram on some of these consequences.
Let's try and think through the media consequences of the heckler's veto. Historically, you can think of it as a radical transformation of the hacker aesthetic. So the early hack, and even now, it's used by criminal gangs, is to overwhelm an internet service and to crash it. That used to be the hack. You crash it. You make a lot of, so the way the internet works is you overload a system. You have requests. The internet works through feedback loops. So when you overload a system, it crashes. That's a hack. Then you enter and deface it. Now you have a very interesting moment where political groups, parties, governments, a lot of governments, even corporations, they can try and crash forms of independent speech. So in online world, this is what a heckler's veto is. You post something, there are 5,000 attacks on you. So it's really not a public square anymore. Of course, these dangers are present in real streets. But in the online world, it's a micro-temporality because it doesn't last for more than 6-7 hours. Maybe it'll last. And suddenly you have a swarm. So the curation of the swarm is a very important aesthetic charge of the political. how do you manage this moment? And it can be done with the help of machine power. You have bots running. You have followers all around the world whose attention is, there are signals where you immediately comment. So this heckler's veto is a very large infrastructure. It's not so in a sense, it seems like one person, but it's not. It's an infrastructural response. It may be 10,000 people and machines may be involved, at a similar moment when someone says something online. So that's what a heckler's veto is today, where you can shout down another person using human and machine speech.
Through the early 2000s, as the heckler's veto took firm root across India's university campuses, it led to increasing fear over what could, if anything, be written, spoken, discussed, or recorded. Bans on books got more frequent, extended to other bans on different kinds of events. Nandini Sundar, professor of sociology at the Delhi University and a member of the Indian Academic Freedom Network, speaking.
I do know that in academic campuses since about 2010, and then dramatically from 2014, we've seen a major shift in what constitutes a problem for public order on campuses. So we see effectively that now it's the ABVP and the RSS which is defining not just what might lead to disruptions on campus, but that they're actually doing the disruptions themselves, and then it's being blamed on the people who were holding the seminars, as if the very act of holding a seminar on the constitution or on democracy or on Kashmir, on Maoism or caste is somehow disruptive of normalized order of the university, where nothing that talks about inequality or the constitution should be discussed. So it's very much an attempt to enforce a new order in the university, which is different from just sort of law and order disruptions outside or potential law and order outside. Because if a film was censored, say on grounds that it would hurt public sentiment, it's not like there is something that is coming in to replace that public sentiment. Whereas now with the university being shut down to these kinds of discussions, it's as if what is worth discussing is only what the RSS thinks is worth discussing. So the most recent attack has been this FIR file today on a professor at JNU and somebody else for writing a book which portrays the history of Manipur wrongly. Now, anybody can get up and say that, they object to your interpretation of the book and produce a counter book. But to say that, what is the right way to interpret Manipur history, right? It's not. So now any academic work becomes potentially, even in its imagining, even before it's done, you have to think about whether if you plan to hold a seminar, if you plan to teach a particular book or a course or, write a book, whether it will violate some imaginary public order that the RSS is going to set up in the future.
Sundar quotes a major Supreme Court judgment from 1989, Rangarajan versus P. Jagjeevan Ram, around the question of the capacity of speech to disrupt public order. Potential threats to law and order predicated on the protests of unreasonable or hypersensitive people could not, says Sundar, be a reason to ban a film or a book. Or, as the Supreme Court asserted,
it is the duty of the state to protect the freedom of expression, since it is a liberty guaranteed against the state. The state cannot plead its inability to handle the hostile audience problem. It is its obligatory duty to prevent it
and protect the freedom of expression. The lawyer Sahana Manjesh explains.
But over time, and I think this is true not only of film, but also of any kind of free speech, whether it's of books, of articles, or just even engaging with people, we've seen that public order has become the new sort of norm to invoke in any kind of situation. And now even more so, it's not just public order, it's actually national security, because you're taking it one step further. And but strangely though, if you were to actually look at the judgments of the Supreme Court or of the High Court so far, they would still say you can't use public order as a reason or as a ground to stop the screening of a film. Because actually the role of the state is to ensure that public order is taken care of. Once a film has been given a certificate, then of course there is a go-ahead for it to be in the public domain. What happens thereafter is for the other wings of the state to step in. So if there is a question of public disorder, then take care of it in that way. Do not ban the speech itself. But I don't think the problem is with the law. The law, I think, on free speech in India is actually fantastic. The problem is with the implementation, and the misuse of it. Because by the time the courts have gone into this question of stating that, public order is no ground for you to stop the screening, the film has already gone through this whole hysterical trajectory where people have asked for it to be banned, where there are smear campaigns, where film distributors are afraid to pick it up, where people are sort of boycotting the film. So the damage that could have happened has already happened to a certain extent.
In the absence of the necessary security that very few institutions have been able to guarantee, through the 2000s, artists, filmmakers, and theatre activists attempted new tactics for self-protection. Across the arts, the emphasis on lightweight mobility has come to be a central feature in protest art as it moves from strategy to tactics, rendering the phenomenon of resistance fleeting, ephemeral, and subject to continual morphing. To perform an intervention which could be the gaining of sudden access to a space, a server, or a URL, and then, just as suddenly, to disperse. Here is Ravi Sundaram speaking of the radical possibilities of this time.
What is most interesting is that in India, this kind of very plastic infrastructure of the early digital era offered all kinds of actors to enter the scene. So, in a sense, it's not just the individual hacker who is kind of allegorized in all the apocalyptic cinema that came around, but all kinds of characters. You had small town players, you had video activists, you had independent filmmakers, political movements, all partaking of this infrastructure. In this sense, it's slightly different from the West, in the sense that it is not the classical post-media that Guattari talked about, which is directly addressing the political and is a counterculture, but it is really a very dynamic and diverse infrastructure. That, I suspect, marks out its distinctiveness in Asia. For example, we had a format called the VCD that was not possible in the West, but it is possible in India because it is a format that Sony developed for Asia.
As hacking took root as a larger cultural practice, it essentially became an act of building upon work done by others with an emphasis on non-original, or we could say post-original work. What we had once called the film director came to morph into something else. As the filmmaker and film viewer became increasingly fused into a single entity, as viewers also began watching with their hands, so to say, the cinema entered a new generation maker culture that inched closer to gaming and memes. The very visible film director, what the French call the régisseur, once an iconic figure of aesthetic modernism, now turned into its polar opposite, an invisible figure, working with and recycling found materials made by others, making their own films available to yet others for future use, part of a larger production chain. The arrival of lightweight Ariflex cameras meant that for the first time filmmakers were freed up to display script and location-bound cinema with the introduction of verite noise.
Chapter 5, Censoring Expanded Cinema.
There are few other mediums of communication that can claim rival levels
of pervasive influence and presence in our daily lives. History shows that films have sparked off political debate and threatened governments, heralded social change, causing society to deviate from age-old dogma, and also sent real-life lovers to their death in their misplaced hope of emulating the classic romances. It is perhaps in seduce of such impelling powers of persuasion that it is the only form of art deemed fit to be regulated by an act of parliament.
That was an AI voice clone of Justice Mukul Mudgal. It is taken from the 2013 Expert Committee to examine issues of certification under the Cinematograph Act of 1952, of which he was the chair. Justice Mudgal's review of the old Cinematograph Act was taking place because, as he correctly wrote, the cinema had undergone a radical change since 1952. Its tools and technology and even its cherished audience have metamorphosed over time. And he was now worrying about how the cinema could be regulated, given that both online and off, it had the same widespread ubiquity as the internet. The Indian cinema, as Justice Mudgal correctly points out, has always been larger than itself. It has a social existence considerably in excess of what is shot, edited, censored and screened inside a movie theatre. What he wanted, however, was to expand the definition of film to include its video versions, its songs and their lyrics, its advertising material, its item numbers, its posters, all the spaces where the cinema reproduced itself as a kind of cinema effect outside of the movie theatre. What he wanted was a fundamentally revamped and vastly expanded censor board to censor all of these.
If the actual content of the film which is being screened at precise cinema location is subject to certification, then as a natural corollary, posters and film material which are displayed everywhere and in public domain must also be subject to
some form of check, regulation and certification. In 2021, the central government found another way to do what Mudgal wanted. It passed a digital media ethics code that directly targeted social media, messaging platforms, web publishers and OTT platforms, creating extreme conditions that made them responsible to anybody with a grievance. The guidelines were framed keeping in mind the difference between viewership in a theatre and television as compared to watching it on internet, said a publicity statement, and were designed to empower what it named ordinary users. Such users were front and center in another proposed regulation, the amendment to the Cinematograph Bill itself. In 2021, the government published a draft for a series of amendments to the Cinematograph Act and invited comments. Sometimes, said the cover note of the draft, complaints are received against a film after the film is certified.
Article 19(2) of the Constitution imposes reasonable restrictions upon the freedom of speech and expression in the interests of the sovereignty and integrity of India, the security of the state, friendly relations with foreign states, public order, decency or morality,
or in relation to contempt of court, defamation or incitement of any offence. It therefore proposed to add a new proviso that gave new granting revisionary powers to the government that many saw as the rise of a super censor, a censor above the censor board itself. On receipt of any references by the central government
in respect of a film certified for public exhibition, the central government may direct the
chairman of the board to re-examine the film. Without the written authorization of the author, said the proposed amendment, nobody, and literally meant nobody, would be permitted to use any audiovisual recording device in place to knowingly make or transmit a copy of a film or a part thereof. No exceptions. This clause directly hit at fair use. Here, no simple reference to the I&B ministry sufficed. It will be heavy fines, not less than 3 lakh rupees, but which may extend to 5% of the audited gross production cost or, very likely, jail time. In 2021, a major signature campaign by filmmakers, film producers and activists responding to the draft bill revising of the Cinematograph Act. Shilpi Gulati, a filmmaker and academic, was together with Sahana Manjesh one of the co-authors of that campaign. Here is Shilpi Gulati describing their concerns in the run-up to their response.
And one aspect of my work that I was looking at was censorship, just a history of censorship of films in India post-independence, and just I was looking at what have been some of the landmark cases which have sort of shaped laws on film censorship in the country. And it's in the midst of that research and writing that I came across this announcement by the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, where they were asking for public consultation on new amendments that were sort of being brought out as the Cinematograph Amendment Bill of 2021. When I was looking at the finer print of what they were proposing and what were the new amendments that they were bringing out, I actually felt that there was some parts that I needed clarification on, and that is why I reached out to Sahana, who's a lawyer and a very good friend. So one part of it was just to understand what is it that the government is proposing. There were obviously several points that they had made in that document. And the one that I particularly wrote about, and of course this was in consultation with Sahana and other people who've been in conversation with us, this one particular clause was basically saying that the central government or the union government would have power to revise a film or recall a film which has already been approved for public exhibition under or by the CBFC, which is the Central Board of Film Certification. And that immediately for us was a red flag, because we understand that filmmakers go through a lot of trouble to get their films passed by the censor board. And here was a new provision that was stating that over and above the power and autonomy of the CBFC, the union government or any party which is at the center would have the power to recall a film. That was one. It was a red flag because it sort of challenged the sovereignty of an autonomous body like the CBFC. And secondly, the way it was worded was very interesting. It said on receipt of any reference, the government could do that, right? And for us, it was important to interrogate, what does that really mean? And looking at a certain kind of history of censorship in the country, one is of course the state censorship or the censorship that comes under the Cinematograph Act. But since the late 1990s, there's also been a new trend of what we call mob censorship or extra-constitutional censorship, where a certain fringe group or a certain vigilante group has claimed their authority on public morality in our country and said, we will tell you what is good for our country or for our people to watch, or they've had major objections to certain kind of content in films. And that kind of censorship that happens on the street is extra-constitutional. So we realized that this kind of an amendment which refers to this idea of receipt of reference would actually embolden these fringe groups who tomorrow, on the basis of a sentiment of hurt or offense or any arbitrary ways, can actually complain to the government and then ask the government to recall or re-censor a film. So it basically gave a lot of power to these fringe groups that actually we should be curtailing when it comes to their claiming of moral authority on Indian culture and what should be watched and seen by audiences. And that is why when I was writing that article, I used the term super censorship. We are anyways in a space where we are fighting against censorship. We are constantly saying that the CBFC should be a certifying body. It should not be a body that makes excisions or cuts or bans or demands filmmakers to creatively change or alter the films they've made. We felt that while the conversation should be at a more progressive way of looking at censorship, this was sort of going 2 steps back, and we were bringing in another layer that is going to make a lot of filmmakers, a lot of producers, and the larger industry or community of filmmakers who are engaged in ideas of public exhibition. I thought it's going to bring another layer of censorship, and they will curtail freedom of speech and expression and creative expression to a large extent. So that is basically where we started.
Expanded cinema saw new battle lines. On one hand was the entire filmmaker's legacy, from Abbas to Shankarappa to Prakash Jha. As Jha asked in 2011, why did we need a censor certificate at all if it wasn't going to be honored?
फिल्म सेंसर ने अप्रूव कर दी हुई है, तो सेंसर के भी तो कोई मानता है कि नहीं है? नहीं तो हम कल को सेंसर जाना बंद कर दें, फिर हम फिल्म बनाने के बाद में अखबार में एडवर्टाइजमेंट दे दें. Absolutely, there is no objectionable content in my film. Absolutely, there is no intent.
On the other arose a more amorphous practice of the digital moving image. Even as this podcast series was being prepared, the Digital Personal Data Protection Bill of 2023 was finally passed. Although it has significantly changed from its 2019 version, it retains several anxieties for what we now call the data principle, whom we might understand as the first maker of the moving image, and a series of data fiduciaries, or all those individuals and institutions through whom the data mediates as it circulates in society. Is the public of 2023, for all its definitional sameness over the centuries, the same as it had been after, say, the Second World War? Perhaps the true question that now emerged was not how much the public had changed, but whether a single definition existed any longer for the film spectator. Or had this category too, like the diversified and fragmented filmmaker, become an abstraction, a ghostly spectator everywhere and nowhere, both hypervisible and invisible? What the cinema could do, it seemed, was to produce effects, montage forms, we may now say, that would not have surprised Eisenstein in the way they seemed no longer to be contained by the film but spilled over outside the movie theatre into signifiers that could not be regulated, policed, or censored. Cinema Strikes is brought to you by the Bangalore International Centre in collaboration with the Centre for the Study of Culture and Society. The podcast design, recording, supervision and assembly is by Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta. Production by Raghu Tenkayala and Lekha Naidu and artwork by Chandini Venkatraman. Thanks as always to V. Ravichandar and the rest of the BIC team for everything.